Oh boy. Hello, this is Chiak. We are back with Resident Evil Code Veronica. I kind of just blocked my voice there. Resident Evil Code Veronica, the novel version by written by S.D Perry. Uh, Chapter 6 is very hot. Let's see if I can actually make my way through more than one chapter. Everything was perfect. The cameras were set so that he could watch from 4 different angles, all in full color. The battle arena well lit, his chair comfortable. He only regretted that he hadn't had time to return to their private residence to watch the entertainment with Alexia by his side, although that had turned out to be advantageous as well, a silver lining. The training facility's control room had cameras that could be re angled with a touch of a button, ensuring the clearest possible view. Alfred smiled, watching as Claire hesitated at the door, quite pleased with how his plan had come to fruition. She chased him as he hoped, stepped into his trap with hardly a struggle. He hadn't expected her to actually fire at him, but that was easily overlooked in retrospect. And truly, it made the anticipation for her upcoming death all the sweeter, the addition of a personal revenge aspect into the mix. The OR1, a highly developed a highly developed BOW specifically created for field combat, was one of Alfred's all-time favorites. The AN3 sandworm was impressive, to be sure. The standard Hunter 121s, lethal and fast, but the OR1s were special. The human skeletal, the human skeletal skill. My good, the human skeletal, the human skeletal structure showed through, particularly in the face and torso, giving them the look of classic death. Their skull faces leered out beneath corded ropes of real and synthetic tendon, like a neo grim reaper. They weren't just dangerous. The way they looked was terror inspiring at the most basic level of instinct. The island employees called them bandersnatches, a nonsense word from some poem that was strangely fitting, considering their unique design and function. There were 30 of them at Rockfort, half of those in stasis, though Alfred had only been able to account for 8 of them since the attack. Oh, Claire was opening the door. Elated, Alfred focused his full attention on the girl, his left hand on the camera controls, his right hovering over the lock functions for the storage areas. Claire stepped onto the balcony of the large, open, 2-story bay with gun in hand, trying to look everywhere at once. Alfred zoomed in on her face, wanting to fully appreciate her fear, but was disappointed by her lack of expression. After surmising that she was in no immediate danger, she seemed watchful no more. But when I push this button, Alfred snickered, unable to contain his excitement, lightly stroking his right forefinger across the switches for the bay's 2 shuttered storage closets. One on the balcony, one bordering the freight elevator on the lower floor. At his whim, Claire Redfield would die. True, she wasn't important. Her death as meaningless as her life had surely been, but it was the control that mattered. His control. And the pain. The exquisite torture. The look in her eyes when she realizes that her existence is at its end. Alfred controlled his body as tightly as he controlled his life, and prided himself on his ability to dominate his sexual desires, to feel nothing unless he chose to. But just thinking of Claire's death inspired in him a passion that was beyond physical lust. beyond words, even beyond the simple scope of man's awareness. Alexia knows, Alfred thought, certain that his beautiful sister was watching too, that she understood what could not be explained. In Claire's death, they would be as close as two people could ever be. It was the wonder of their relationship, the culmination of the Ashford legacy. He couldn't contain himself another moment. As Claire took another cautious step into the center of the room, he first locked the door she'd come through, sealing off her escape, and then pressed the button for the second story shutter release. Instantly, the narrow metal shutter not 10 feet from where she stood slid open, and as Claire stumbled backward, trying to distance herself from the unknown threat, a fully matured Bandersnatch stepped out, ready to engage. It was beautiful, the creature. Between 7 and 8 feet tall, its face was that of a grinning skeleton, its head set low and menacing. The disproportionately huge oh my god, the disproportionately huge upper body supported its primary weapon, the right arm, as thick as one of its tree trunk legs, longer than half its full body length at rest. The hands spanned big enough to cover an ordinary man's entire chest. Its left arm was withered, tiny and misshapen, but a Bandersnatch only needed the one. Alfred had hoped for some exclamation from her, a curse or a scream, but she was silent as she retreated to what she believed to be a safe distance. She opened fire almost immediately. The Bandersnatch roared, a rough, guttural scream, and then performed its trick. Alfred had seen it a dozen times, but never tired of watching. The massive right arm snapped toward Claire, probably 15 feet away, the engineered muscles hyperextending, the elastic tendons and ligaments stretching, and it slapped Claire to the ground with scarcely any effort. The girl knocked sprawling before the Bandersnatch's arm snapped back into place. Yes, oh yes. Claire crabbed backward as fast as she could, stopped only when her back hit the wall. Alfred zoomed in to see that a fine sheen of sweat had broken across her face, but she still wore no expression beyond a kind of intense watchfulness. She pulled herself to her feet and sidestepped along the wall, moving fast, obviously not wanting to be knocked off the balcony by the creature's next blow. Alfred grinned, ignoring the disappointment that her apparent lack of terror had brought about. She'd be out of wall in another few seconds, backed into a corner, and then a series of blows, beating her to death against the wall. Or a simple neck snap, a grasp of her head, and a single solid shake. Oh, Aurelia toy with her, tossing her around like one of Alexia's rag dolls. Alfred leaned in eagerly, changing the angle for one of the cameras watching as the doomed girl raised her weapon, taking careful aim in spite of her hopeless position. Bam! The Bandersnatch shrieked even louder than the gunshot, shaking its head wildly, dark fluids rushing from its moving face. It sprayed the balcony walls with Icarus liquid, blood and other things, trying desperately to bring its arm up, to protect or comfort its wound. It all happened so fast, so violently. It was like watching a fountain geyser suddenly explode from a still lake. The eyes. She went for its eyes. Bam! Claire shot again, and the Bandersnatch cried out in fury and new pain, still trying to grasp its own injured head as it stumbled around in a weaving circle. And then, to Alfred's shock, it collapsed to the floor, its writhing becoming less and less urgent, its scream becoming a hoarse, dying protest. Stunned with disbelief, Alfred could finally see an emotion on Claire's face: pity. She moved to stand over the creature and shot once more, stilling it completely. Then she turned and walked toward the stairs as casually as if she was walking away from a ladies' luncheon. No, 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 no! This was wrong, all wrong. But it wasn't over, not yet. Furious, he stabbed at the other switch, releasing the second creature from its enclosure, the shutter sliding open behind a stack of storage containers on the elevator. On the elevator level. You won't be so fortunate this time, he thought desperately, still barely able to credit what he'd just seen. Claire had heard the second door open, but the stack of containers obscured her point of view, hiding the new menace. She was stopped at the foot of the stairs, holding herself very still, scanning for the exact source of the noise. The second Bandersnatch stepped out of its closet and casually reached up, grasping a large metal crate at the top of the 10-foot stack of them. It pulled itself up, seemingly without effort, and without Claire noticing, her attention too intently fixed on the shadowy corner opposite the stairs. The Bandersnatch reached down for her. Claire saw it coming at the last instant, too late to get out of its way. The creature wrapped its muscular fingers around her head and lifted her up, studying her as a cat studied a mouse. Or a rat, Alfred thought, some of his previous joy returning at the sight of the girl dropping her weapon and struggling to free herself, grasping at the OR-1's steel grip with panicked hands. And Alfred's focus was broken at the sound of shattering glass somewhere off screen. And someone was shooting. The sudden flurry of noise and activity making the Bandersnatch shriek, making it drop Claire. What's the window? Alfred answered himself, watching in horror as the young prisoner Burnside threw himself into camera shot, firing two handguns at once, blasting at the startled creature, startled, then screaming in agony as Claire scooped up her weapon and joined the fray. The Bandersnatch tried to attack, its arms whipping out toward the new assailant, but it was driven back by the sheer number of rounds being pumped into its body, finally slumping against a storage container. Dead. Without consciously deciding to do it, Alfred reached for the freight elevator controls, a part of him remembering that there was at least one more OR-1 below, as well as a number of virus carriers. The two of these stumbled as the floor beneath their feet began to go down, taking them to the basement of the training facility. There were no working cameras there, but enjoying their deaths was no longer Alfred's primary concern. Not so long as they died. Can't be. This can't be happening. The OR-1s should have dispatched Claire and her meddlesome friend effortlessly, but they were alive and his pets had suffered and died. He tried to convince himself that the two would soon perish in the basement, which had been locked down and isolated since the first viral leak. But suddenly, nothing seemed certain anymore. Alexia, Alfred whispered, feeling the blood drain from his face, feeling his very being flush with shame. He had to make her see that it wasn't his fault, that his trap had worked perfectly, that the impossible had occurred, and he'd have to accept the subsequent coolness in her gaze. The undertone of disappointment in her sweet voice as she reassured him that she understood. The only thing that surpassed his shame was a newfound hatred for Claire Redfield, burning brighter than 1,000 burning stars. No sacrifice was too great to secure her torment. Hers and that of her shining knight. Until both had offered penitence in flesh and blood, Alfred would not rest. He swore it. "Steve, other side," Claire said, the instant the freight elevator began to move. Steve nodded. Claire reloaded and Steve clambered over two of the heavy crates, both luggers raised. As if by silent agreement, neither of them spoke as the lift descended, both watching intently for what came next. He saved my life, Claire thought wonderingly, watching grease-smeared wall tracks slide past, blood still screaming through her veins from when she'd realized she would die. And Steve Burnside, who she'd written off as a well-intentioned but troubled, barely competent blowhard, had kept that from happening. Though he may only have delayed the inevitable. She didn't know what Alfred had in mind now, but she wasn't looking forward to meeting any more of his friends. Two skull-faced, rubber-band-armed freaks had been more than enough. She'd been incredibly lucky to get off with a couple of bruises and a sore neck. Claire had expected the elevator to drop them into some sort of BOW holding area, but she was pleasantly disappointed. The massive lifts simply came to a stop. There was only one exit that she could see, and although she harbored no illusions about how safe things would be on the other side of that door, it seemed they were out of danger for the moment. "Hey Claire, check it out." Steve climbed back over the boxes, holding what could only be some kind of submachine gun, boxy, dark and deadly looking with an extended magazine. "He was behind one of the crates," Steve said happily. He'd already stuck the gold luggers in his belt. 9mm, just like the luggers and the guard weapons. Oh, by the way, here." He reached into one of the outside pockets on his camo pants and pulled out 3 clips for the M93R. "I searched a couple of guards on my way back from the dock. I like the luggers better, and now that I've got this," he held up the new weapon, grinning, "I don't need the extra hardware. You can have the gun too." Claire gratefully accepted the clips and the weapon, not sure how to thank him for what he'd done, determined to try anyway. "Steve, if you hadn't shown up when you did, forget it," he said, shrugging. "We're even now." "Well, thanks all the same," Claire said, smiling warmly. He smiled back, and she saw a flicker of real interest in his gaze, and sincerity there that was quite different from his previous posturing. Not sure what to do about it, for him or for herself. She moved the conversation along. I thought you were going to wait at the dock," she said. "It wasn't really a dock," Steve said, and told her what had happened since they'd separated. The seaplane was terrific news. Having to deal with Umbrella's bizarre key fetish yet again wasn't so terrific. "And when I couldn't find them, I thought I'd wander over and see if you'd come across anything like that," he finished, shrugging again, working hard to look nonchalant. "That's when I heard the shots. How about you? Anything interesting? Besides meeting with a couple of Umbrella's monsters, I mean." "I'll say. Do you know anything about Alfred Ashford?" "Only that him and his sister are total fruitcakes," Steve said promptly, "and that the guards were scared of him. I could tell the way they avoided talking about him. He sent his own assistant to the infirmary, I heard. There was some whacked-out doctor working there, I guess. A lot of prisoners got taken to the infirmary and never came back. Doesn't take a genius, you know?" Claire nodded, fascinated in spite of herself. "What about the sister?" "I never heard much about her, except she's some kind of shut-in," Steve said. "No one even knows what she looks like. I think her name is Alexandra, maybe? I don't know. I don't remember. Why?" She filled him in on her encounters with Alfred, followed by a brief synopsis of where she'd been and what she'd found. When she mentioned that she had the medication she'd been looking for, Steve scowled and then blinked, his face clearly expressing a sudden change of heart. "Maybe this umbrella guy." "Rodrigo," Claire interjected. "Okay, whatever. Steve said impatiently. Maybe he knows something about these proof key things, like where they are. Good idea. It would beat searching the entire island, wouldn't it? Claire said. He up for a trip back to the prison? Assuming we can get out of here. Assuming we can get out of here, that is. Oh, I'll clear a path. I'll clear us a path, Steve said, not a trace of doubt in his voice. You just leave that part to me. Claire opened her mouth to comment on the pitfalls of overconfidence, particularly where Umbrella was concerned, then closed it again. Maybe it was his belief in himself that had carried him this far, that by not accepting the possibility of defeat, he was assuring himself a win. Fine in theory, dangerous in practice. She'd be there to cover him at least. We're on the first floor of the training we were on the first floor of the training facility, he continued, which means we're in the basement. Which means we're in the basement now. I know for my... Steve shook his head, flustered for some reason. But before she could ask about it, he continued on as if nothing had happened. There's a boiler room and a sewer area, basically. We go that way, he said, gesturing at the door. Claire decided not to point out that since it was the only door, she'd already come to that conclusion. I'm right behind you. Stay close, Steve said roughly, walking to the door and looking back over the shoulder, trying to look fierce, his jaw set and his eyes narrowed. Claire was torn between irritation and laughter, finally choosing to think of it as endearing. Then he was opening the door, and the reality of their situation came back to her, floating in on the smell of a gangrenous tissue. She stopped worrying about the little things, concentrating on the need to survive. What Steve knew about guns, he could sum up in about 5 seconds. But he knew what he liked, and he decided immediately upon pulling the trigger of his newest find that it was the shit hands down. He stepped out of the freight elevator ready to kick some rotten ass and saw his opportunity less than 10 feet away. There were 5 of them in all. Well, 5.5, including the crawling mess on the floor over by the shelves. And all he had to do was tap the trigger. And then he was trying like hell to keep the weapon from flying out of his hand. Bam, 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 bam. He swept the kicking gun left to right, releasing the trigger as the last zombie's Swiss cheese brain parted company with its Swiss cheese head. It was all over in just a few seconds, so fast that it seemed unreal, like he'd coughed and the building had blown up or something. Claire had taken care of the floor pizza during his sweep, and when he turned around triumphant, he was a little surprised to see that she wasn't smiling until he thought about it for a second, and then he felt a little ashamed of himself. As far as he was concerned, they weren't really people anymore. He knew that if he were ever infected, he'd want someone to plug him, to keep him from hurting anyone else, not to mention granting him a fast death rather than letting him rot on the hoof. On the hoof? On the hoof, that's what it says. I don't know. Sorry. Rot on the hoof. That is I've never come across something like that. I'm assuming it's not supposed to be roof. Interesting. Anyway, continue on. But they were human ones. What happened to them was entirely shitty and unfair, no question. True. Maybe he should be more respectful. But on the other hand, the gun was extremely cool. And they were zombies. It was a touchy subject, not one that he was prepared to mess around with, but he decided he could at least not laugh about it in front of Claire. He didn't want her to think he was some bloodthirsty asshole. He pointed at the door ahead to the right, fairly sure that they were heading in the right direction, at least roughly. The way he figured it, they'd come out at least close to the front yard of the training facility. Claire nodded, and Steve led the way once again, pushing the door open and stepping through. They were standing at the top of a lift. They were standing at the top of a half flight of open stairs leading down into the boiler room, a room full of big, battered looking hissing machinery anyway. What? A room full of big, battered looking hissing machinery anyway. Steve didn't actually know what a boiler looked like. There were four zombies milling around between them and the steps leading up and out on the other side of the cold, hissing room. Steve raised the machine gun and was about to fire when Claire tapped his arm, moving to stand beside him. "Watch," she said, and pointed her 9mm at the zombie group. Not quite, he saw. She was aiming low at something just past them. And pow! Boom! 3 of the creatures went down blackened and smoking. Behind them, what was left of a small, obviously combustible container, only jagged curls of splayed metal surrounded by a I need to slow that down. Behind them, what was left of a small, obviously combustible container, only jagged curls of splayed metal surrounded by a smudge of toxic smoke. The fourth zombie had been hit, but not as hard. Claire took it out with a single headshot before speaking again. "Saves ammo," she said simply, and brushed past him to walk down the steps. Steve followed, slightly awed by her, but playing it detached, like he'd already thought of that. If there was one thing he knew about chicks, it was that they didn't like guys who mooned all over them, acting all goofy. "Not that I give a shit what she thinks about me," he told himself. He told himself firmly. "She's just kind of cool is all." Claire reached the next door first and waited until he caught up, nodding that he was ready. As soon as she opened it, they both relaxed. He could see her shoulders loosen and felt his own heart beating again. A dark stone walkway, totally empty, open on one side. There was water running somewhere below, and some kind of narrow gate straight ahead, like an old-fashioned elevator door. "This is starting to seem a little too easy," Claire said softly. "Yeah," Steve whispered back. So much for Alfie Boy's evil playground shtick. They were about halfway across when they heard it, echoing up from somewhere in the black running waters below. A strangely high, piercing trill. Inhuman, but not like an animal either. Whatever it was, it sounded extremely pissed, and from the splashing noises, it was coming closer. Steve was ready to start shooting, but Claire grabbed his arm and took off running, practically jerking him off his feet. They were at the lift in about 2 seconds. Claire ripping the gate aside and shoving him into a tiny elevator cab, jumping in after him and slamming the gate closed. "Okay, geez, you don't have to push," Steve said, rubbing his arm indignantly. Oh my goodness, I can't speak. Indignantly. Steve said, rubbing his arm indignantly. "Sorry," she said, pushing an errant strand of hair behind one ear, looking as rattled as he'd seen her get. "It's just, I've heard that sound before. Hunters, I think they're called. Extremely bad news. There were a bunch of them loose in Raccoon." She smiled shakingly, which suddenly made him want to put his arm around her, or hold her hand, or something. He didn't. "Brings up some bad memories, she said. Raccoon. That was the place that had been blown up a few months ago, if he remembered right before he'd come to Rockfort. The town's own police chief had done it. Did Umbrella have something to do with Raccoon?" Claire seemed surprised, but then smiled a little easier, turning her attention to the elevator controls. "Long story. I'll tell you about it when we get out of here. So, first floor?" "Yeah," Steve said, then changed his mind. "Actually, maybe we should go up to the second. That way we can go out over the yard, see what we'll be up against." You know, you're smarter than you look, Claire said teasingly, punching the button. Steve was still trying to think of a witty comeback when the elevator came to a stop, and Claire opened the door. There was a shuttered lockdown door to their right, so they went left, the short hallway empty. There was only one door in that direction, too, but they were in luck. The knob turned when Claire tried it. Again, there was no surprises. The door opened up to a cramped wooden balcony thick with dust, overlooking a big room full of junk: a rusted military jeep, stacks of grungy old oil drums, broken boxes, and the like. It seemed more like a storage shed than anything else, and though it was well lit, there were enough piles of crap that it was impossible to see if anyone was down there. There was, though, Steve could hear. There was, though. Steve could hear shuffling noises. He took a few steps to the left, trying to see the corner beneath the balcony, and Claire followed. The boards creaked and shifted underneath their steps. Doesn't seem too sturdy, Claire started, and was cut off by a giant splinter crack, pieces of the balcony floor flying up as both of them went down. Shit! Steve didn't even have time to tense for the impact. It was over so quick. He landed on his left side, jarring his shoulder, his left knee cracking against a random bit of wood. Almost immediately, a pyramid of empty barrels fell over behind him, clattering hollowly to the clattering hollowly hollowly clattering hollowly to the ground, and Steve heard a zombie's hungry wail. Claire? Steve called, crawling to his feet and turning, looking for her and the zombie. There she was amid the barrels, still down, rubbing one ankle. Her handgun was about 10 feet away. Steve saw her eyes go wide and followed her gaze. A lone zombie teetering toward her, and all he could do was stare at it, his body suddenly a million miles away. Claire said something, but he couldn't hear her, too intent on the virus carrier. It had been a big man leaning toward fat, but someone had blasted off a part of his gut. The open, sticky belly wounds were seeping, the dark shirt made even darker by the almost uniform layer of blood that had soaked the cloth. It was gray-faced and hollow-eyed like all of them, and had either bitten through its tongue or had been eating its mouth smeared with blood. Claire said something else, but Steve was remembering something. A sudden, vivid flash of memory so real that it was almost like reliving the experience. He'd been 4 or 5 years old when his parents had taken him to his first parade, a Thanksgiving parade. He was sitting on his father's shoulder, watching the clowns go by, surrounded by loud, shouting people, and he'd started to cry. He couldn't remember why. What he remembered was his father looking up at him, his eyes concerned and full of love. When he'd asked what was wrong, his voice was so familiar and well loved that Steve had wrapped his tiny arms around his father's neck and hidden his face, still crying but knowing he was safe, that no harm could come to him as long as his father held him. Steve! Claire, practically screaming his name, and he saw that the zombie was almost on top of her, its gray fingers closing around her vest, pulling her up to its drooling, bloody mouth. Steve screamed too, opening fire, the thunder of bullets ripping into his father's face and body, tearing him away from Claire. He kept firing, kept screaming until his father lay still and the thunder had stopped, only dry clicks coming from the gun. And then Claire was touching his shoulder, turning him away as he called out for his father, weeping. They sat for a while. When he could speak, he told her about it, parts of it, his arms around his knees and head down. Told her about his father, who had worked for Umbrella as a truck driver, who had been caught trying to steal a formula from one of their labs. He told her about his mother, who had been gunned down by a trio of Umbrella soldiers in their own home, lay choking and bloody and dying on the living room floor when Steve came home from school. The men had taken them away. Steve taken and his father to Rockfort. The men had taken them away, taken Steve and his father to Rockfort. I thought he was killed in the airstrike, Steve said, wiping at his eyes. I wanted to feel bad about it. I did. But I just kept thinking about Mom, about how she looked. But I didn't want him to die. I didn't. I loved him too. Saying out loud made him start crying again. Claire's arm was around him, but he barely felt it. So sad that he thought he might die. He knew he had to get up. He had to find the keys and go with Claire and fly the plane, but none of that seemed important anymore. Claire had been mostly quiet, only listening and holding him, but she stood up now and told him to stay where he was, that she'd be back soon and then they could leave. That was okay. It was good. He wanted to be alone. And he was more exhausted than ever. And he was more exhausted than he'd ever been in his life, so tired and heavy that he didn't want to move. Claire went away, and Steve decided that he should go looking for the proof keys soon, very soon as he stopped shaking. Okay, so I'm trying to determine where the sun exactly is. Excuse me, I don't know if I actually want to continue reading. Okay. Yeah, it is just behind the building. How big is chapter? Because again, it is very, very hot. I also don't want to just leave this to one chapter. Okay. I'm going to try to read the second chapter. I'm going to take a few minutes though. Just, oh my god. What is the temperature? 34. And then plus humidity, technically more. Okay. Commit to this. Chapter 7. Here we go. In the cool darkness, Rodrigo had been resting uneasily. Now he heard a noise out in the corridor and forced himself to open his eyes to get ready. He lifted his weapon, bracing his wrist on the desk when he realized he hadn't the strength to hold it up. I'll kill anyone who messes with me, he thought, more by habit than anything else. Glad he had the gun even if he was already a dead man. A zombie guard had fallen down the stairs and crawled into the cell room sometime after the girl had left. But Rodrigo had killed it with a boot to the head and taken its weapon, still holstered on its broken hip. He waited, wishing that he could go back to sleep, trying to stay alert. The gun eased his mind, took away a lot of his fear. He was going to die soon. It was inevitable. But he didn't want to become one of them, no matter what. Suicide was supposed to be a particularly awful sin. He also knew that if he couldn't manage to wipe out an approaching virus carrier, he'd eat a bullet before he let it touch him. He was probably going to hell anyway. Footsteps, and someone was walking into the room too fast. A zombie? His senses weren't working right. He couldn't tell if things were speeding up or he was slowing down, but he knew he had to shoot soon or he'd miss his chance. Suddenly, a light, small but penetrating, and there she was, standing in front of him like some dream. The Redfield girl, alive, holding a lighter up in the air. She left it burning, set it on the desk like a tiny lantern. What are you doing here? Rodrigo mumbled. But she was rummaging through a pack at her waist, not looking at him. He let the heavy gun drop from his fingers, closing his eyes for a second or a moment. When he opened them again, she was reaching for his arm, a syringe in one hand. It's hemostatic medicine, she said, her hands and voice soft, the prick of the needle small and quick. Don't worry. You won't OD or anything. Somebody wrote dosage numbers on the back of the bottle. It says it'll slow down any internal bleeding, so you should be okay until help comes. I'll leave the lighter here. My brother gave it to me. It's good luck. As she spoke, Rodrigo concentrated on waking up, on overcoming the apathy that had taken him over. What she was telling him didn't make sense, because he'd let her go. She was gone. Why would she come back to help him? Because I let her go. The realization touched him, flooded him with feelings of shame and gratitude. You're very kind, he whispered, wishing there was something he could do for her, something he could say that would repay her for the compassion. He searched his memories, rumors, and facts about the island. Maybe she can escape. The guillotine, he said, blinking up at her, trying not to slur his words too badly. Infirmary's behind it. Keys in my pocket. Supposed to be secrets there. He knows things. Puzzle pieces. You know where's the guillotine? Claire nodded. Yes. Thank you, Rodrigo. That helps me a lot. You rest now, okay? She reached out and stroked his hair back from his forehead. A simple gesture, but so sweet. So nice, you wanted to weep. Rest, she said again, and he closed his eyes, calmer, more at peace than he'd ever felt in his life. His last thought before he drifted off was that if she could forgive him after the things he'd done, show him such mercy as if he deserved it, maybe he wouldn't go to hell after all. Rodrigo had been right about secrets. Claire stood at the end of the hidden basement corridor, steeling herself to open the unmarked door in front of her. The infirmary itself was small and unpleasant, not at all what she would have expected for an umbrella clinic. No medical equipment to be seen, nothing modern at all. There was only a single examination table in the front room. The splintery wooden floor around it stained with blood, a tray of medieval-looking tools nearby. The adjoining room had been burned beyond recognition. She couldn't tell what purpose it had served, but it looked like a cross between a recovery room and a crematorium. It smelled like one, too. There was a tiny cluttered office just off the first room. A lone body sprawled in front of it. A man in a stained lab coat who had died with a look of horror on his narrow ashen face. He didn't appear to have been infected, and since there was no virus carriers in the room and no obvious wounds, she guessed that he'd had a heart attack or something like it. The contorted expression on his pinched features, bulging eyes, and gaping downturned mouth suggested to her that he died of fright. Claire carefully stepped over him and found the first secret in the small office almost by accident. Her boot had nudged something when she walked in, a marble or stone that had rolled across the floor, which had turned out to be the most unusual key. It was a glass eye, one that belonged in the grotesque plastic face of the office anatomical dummy, propped leering in the corner. Considering what Steve had said about no one coming back from the infirmary, and considering what she already knew about the kind of insanity that umbrellas seemed to attract, Claire wasn't surprised to find a hidden passage behind the office wall. A worn set of stone steps were revealed when she placed the eye back where it belonged, which hadn't really surprised her either. It was a secret, a trick, An umbrella was all about secrets and tricks. So open the door already. Get it over with. Right. She didn't have all day. She didn't want to leave Steve alone for too long either. She was worried about him. He'd had to kill his own father. She couldn't imagine the kind of psychological damage that would do to someone. Claire shook her head, irritated with her own dawdling. It didn't matter that she was in a barren, frightening place where lots of people had apparently died, where she could feel the pervasive atmosphere of terror emanating from the cold walls, trying to wrap around her like a burial shroud. Doesn't matter, she said, and opened the door. Immediately, 3 stumbling virus carriers started for her, drawing her attention, keeping her from really seeing the details of the large room they'd been trapped in. All 3 were badly disfigured, missing limbs and long, ragged strips of skin, their putrefying flesh flayed and raw. They moved slowly, painfully dragging themselves toward her, and she could see older scars on the exposed, rotting tissue. Even as she targeted the first, the knot of dread in her stomach was expanding, making her feel sick. It was over quickly. At least, it was over quickly, at least. But the terrible suspicion that had been growing in her mind, that she'd been hoping was false, was confirmed with a single good look around. Oh, Jesus. The room was strangely elegant, the muted lighting coming from a hanging chandelier. The floor was tiled, with a runner of finely woven carpet leading from the door to a kind of sitting area on the other side of the room. There was an overstuffed velvet chair and cherry wood end table there, the chair facing out so that someone sitting there would be able to see the entire room, which was worse than she could have imagined, worse than the mad Chief Iron's dungeon hidden beneath the streets of Raccoon. There were 2 custom-built water wells, one with a pillory built into its rails, a steel cage suspended over the other. Chains hung from the walls, some with well-used manacles attached, some with leather collars, some with hooks. There were a few elaborate devices that she didn't look at too closely, things with gears and metal spikes. Swallowing back bile, Claire focused on the sitting area. Elegance of the furnishing and of the room itself made things worse somehow, adding a touch of warped ego to the obvious psychosis of its creator. Like it wasn't enough to enjoy torturing people. She wanted to observe it in luxury, like some mad aristocrat. She saw a book on the end table and walked over to retrieve it, keeping her gaze fixed straight ahead. Virus, zombies, and monsters and useless death were all horrible things, tragic or frightening, or both. But the kinds of sickness represented by the chains and devices all around her was appalling to her very soul, because it made her want to give up her faith in humanity. The book was actually a journal, leather bound with thick, high-quality paper. The inner cover proclaimed that it was the property of a Dr. Enoch Stoker, no title or inscription otherwise. And those things, puzzle pieces. Claire didn't want to touch the thing, let alone read it, but Rodrigo had seemed to think it might help. She flipped through a few pages, saw that nothing was dated, and started scanning the narrow, spidery writing for a familiar word or name. Something about puzzles, maybe. There, an entry that made several references to Alfred Ashford. She took a deep breath and started at the top. We finally talked today about the details of my preferences and pleasures. Mr. Ashford wouldn't share his own, but he was most encouraging to me, as he's been since my arrival 6 weeks ago. He was informed at the beginning that my needs are unconventional, but now he knows everything, even the small things. I was uncomfortable at first, but Mr. Ashford, Alfred, he insists I call him Alfred, proved to be an eager audience. He said that he and his sister both strongly approve of research and the boundaries of experience. He told me that I should think of them as kindred spirits, and that here I am free. It was strange describing aloud my feelings, sensations, and thoughts that I've never shared. I told him about how it all started when I was still a boy, about the animals I experimented with early on and later the other children. I didn't know then that I was capable of killing, but I knew that the sight of blood excited me. That causing pain filled an empty, lonely space inside with profound feelings of power and control. I think he understands about the screaming, about how important the screaming is to me, and enough. This wasn't what she was looking for, and it was making her want to vomit. She turned a few pages, found another entry about Alfred and his sister, scanned over something about a private home, and leant back, frowning. Alfred attended one of my live autopsies today and told me afterward that Alexia has asked after me, that she wants to know if I have everything I need. Alfred worships Alexia. Will let no one near her. I haven't asked to meet her yet and have no plans to do so. Alfred wants their private home to remain private, to keep her all to himself. It's behind the common mansion, he told me. Most people don't even know it exists. Alfred tells me things that no one else knows. I think he appreciates having an acquaintance with common interest. He said that Rockfort has many places that require unusual keys, much like the eye he gave me. Some new, some very old. Edward Ashford, Alfred's grandfather, was apparently obsessed with secrecy, an obsession shared by Umbrella's other founder, according to Alfred. He and Alexia are the only people alive who know all the hidden places at Rockfort, he said. Alfred had full sets of keys made for both of them when he took over his father's position. He joked that it's good to have a spare in case he ever locks himself out, and he laughed. He said that Alexia would always let him in. I believe that twins often have a much deeper bond than other sets of siblings. That, in a figurative sense, if you cut one, the other will bleed. I'd like very much to test this theory in a more literal way regarding pain levels. I found that filling a fresh wound with cut glass and sewing it closed again is a. Sickened, Claire tossed the book aside and wiped her hands on her jeans, deciding that she had enough information to go on. She hoped quite sincerely that the corpse upstairs was Dr. Stoker's, that his black heart had failed him, and it was the thought of going to hell that had frozen his face into a mask of terror. And she abruptly realized that she'd had more than enough of his atmosphere, that if she had to be in the infirmary for one more minute, she really was going to throw up. She turned and walked quickly to the door, was full on running by the time she reached the stairs. She took them two at a time and sprinted through the upstairs room, not looking at the body, not thinking about anything but the need to get out. When she hit the outside path that led back to the guillotine door, she collapsed against one wall and breathed in huge lungfuls of air, concentrating on keeping her gorge down. It took a couple of minutes before she was out of the danger zone. When she felt ready, Claire plugged a fresh clip in her semi and started back toward the training facility. She realized that she'd lost the second weapon Steve gave her somewhere between the torture chamber and the front door, but there was nothing on earth that would persuade her to step foot back inside. She was going to get Steve, and they would find those goddamn keys, and then they were getting the fuck away from the asylum that Umbrella had created at Rockfort. Steve cried for a while and rocked himself back and forth for a while, duly aware that dully aware that he'd just done a very big thing as far as lifetime experiences went. There was a small shit, and then capital B big. There were some things that just changed people forever, and this was one of them. He had to kill his own father. Both his parents, good people who meant no harm, were dead. That meant there was no one in the world who loved him now. It was that thought that kept repeating itself, making him cry and rock back and forth. It was thinking about the luggers that finally snapped him out of the private emotional hell he was in. Excuse me. That snapped him out of the private emotional hell he was in, that made him remember where he was and what was happening. He still felt entirely terrible, aching inside and out, but he started to tune back into his environment, wishing that Claire was with him, wishing for a glass of water. The luggers. Steve rubbed at his swollen eyes and then pulled both of them from under his belt, staring down at them. It was stupid, unimportant, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he finally connected that when he'd taken the matched handguns off the wall, that was when he'd been locked in and the heat had gone on. It had been a trap, and as far as he could figure, the only purpose of a trap like that was to keep someone from taking the weapons. Which means maybe they're useful for something besides shooting. Yeah, they were gilded and cool looking and probably expensive, but the Ashfords obviously weren't hurting for money. And if the guns had some kind of sentimental value, why were they being used as part of a trap? He decided that he wanted to go back and take a closer look at where they'd been hanging, see if putting them back did anything. It was a 2-minute walk back to the mansion, tops. He could be there and back in 5. Claire would wait for him if she got back first. If I stay here, I'll just keep crying. He needed something to do. Steve stood up, feeling shaky and kind of hollow as he brushed dirt off his pants, unable to avoid looking over at where his father had died. He felt a rush of relief when he saw that Claire had covered him up with a piece of tarp. She was a great girl, though for some reason he suddenly felt kind of weird about her, about telling her all that stuff. He wasn't sure how he felt. He stepped outside and was vaguely surprised to see that he wasn't in the front yard of the training facility. He was also vaguely surprised that in the small, high-walled square, he had walked into what appeared to be a World War II Sherman tank. Giant mud-crusted treads, revolving turret with huge gun, the whole deal. He might have been interested earlier, or at least more than a little surprised. There was no reason at all for there to be a tank at the Rockfort facility. But now all he wanted to do was check out the lugger trap. See if he could at least contribute something toward getting them off the island. He felt kind of bad that Claire had been stuck with questioning the wounded umbrella guy by herself, since it was his idea and all. On the other side of the tank was a door that did open into the training yard. At least his sense of direction wasn't totally blown. It seemed darker than it had earlier. Steve looked up and saw that the sky had gone cloudy again, blocking the moon and stars. He was about halfway across the yard when he heard thunder, loud enough that the very ground seemed to quake a little beneath his feet. By the time he reached the other side, it had started to rain again. Steve stepped up the pace, hanging right at the exit and jogging for the mansion. The rain was heavy and cold, but he welcomed it, opening his mouth and turning his face to the sky, letting it wash over him. He was soaked in just a few seconds. "Steve!" Claire. He felt his stomach knot up a little, turning to watch her approach. She caught up to him outside the door to the mansion's ground, wearing a concerned expression. Are you all right?" she asked, studying him uncertainly, blinking rain out of her eyes. Steve wanted to tell her that he was aces, that he'd shaken off the worst of it and was ready to get back to the zombie smackdown. But when he opened his mouth, none of that came out. I don't know. I think so, he said truthfully. He managed a half smile, not wanting her to worry too much, but not wanting to talk about it either. She seemed to understand, swiftly changing the topic. I found out that the Ashford twins have a private house hidden behind the mansion, she said. And I'm not 100% sure, but the keys we're looking for might be there. I think there's a good chance. You found all that out from Rodrigo? Steve asked doubtfully. It was hard to imagine that an Umbrella employee would give that up to the enemy. Claire hesitated, then nodded. In a roundabout way, she said, and he suddenly had the impression that there was something she didn't want to talk about. He didn't push it, just waited. The problem is getting to the house, she continued. I'm sure it's locked up tight. I was thinking we might poke around the mansion a little more, see if we can find a map or a passage. She pushed her dripping bangs out of her eyes and smiled. She pushed her dripping bangs out of her eyes, smiling. And, get out of the rain before we get wet. Steve agreed. They went through the entrance to the manicured grounds, stepping over a few corpses along the way. He filled her in on his idea about the luggers, which she thought they should definitely pursue. Although, she also pointed out that with the Ashford family running the island, Umbrella's cute little puzzles didn't necessarily need to be logical. They stopped at the front door to do what they could about their clothes, which turned out to be not much. Both of them were drenched, though they did their best to squeeze out the excess. Fortunately for both of them, their feet had stayed dry. Wet clothes were a pain in the ass, but trying to get around in squelching boots seriously sucked the root. Weapons up, Steve pushed the door open. Shivering, they stepped inside and heard a door close, upstairs and to the right. Alfred, Steve said, keeping his voice low. Bet your money. What say we put a few holes in his sorry ass? He started for the stairs, the question rhetorical. That loony craphound needed to be dead, for more reasons than Steve could count. Claire caught up to him, but put a hand on his shoulder. Listen, some of the stuff I found back at the prison, he's not just crazy, he's seriously deranged. Like serial killer deranged. Yeah, I got that, Steve said. All the more reason to take him out ASAP. Just let's be careful, okay? Claire seemed worried, and Steve felt protective all of a sudden, big time. Oh yeah, he's going down, he thought grimly, but nodded for Claire's sake. You got it. They moved quickly up the stairs, stopping outside the door they heard close. Steve stepped ahead of Claire, who cocked an eyebrow but said nothing. On 3, he whispered, turning the knob very slowly, relieved that it was unlocked. 1, 2, 3. He shouldered the door hard, bursting into the room and sweeping with the machine pistol, ready to shoot the first thing that moved. But nothing did. The room, a softly lit office lined with bookshelves, was empty. Claire had gone in and turned left, past the couch and coffee table on the north wall. Disappointed, Steve stepped after her, expecting another door to another hall, so sick of the stupid mazes all over the place that he could just shit. He stopped and stared. Exactly what Claire was doing. Perhaps 10 feet away was a wall, a dead end with 2 empty spaces set and a plaque at about chest level. Indentations shaped like luggers. Steve felt a flush of adrenaline, of victory. He had no rational reason to believe that they just found the way to the Ashfords' private residence, but he believed they had anyway. So it seemed. Had Claire. I think we've got it, she said softly. Bet your money. Okay. Okay, chapter 7 was actually a lot shorter. No, actually, it's about the same. So I'm thinking of like the time of when I finished reading the 6th chapter. It's about the same length. So, okay, that was chapter 6 and 7 of Resident Evil Code Veronica. I'm going to end things here because I'm sitting here and just sweating just by sitting here. So, drink water. If drink water, and thank you for liking if you liked. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, guys. See ya. End the stream. Drink